She sends a lottery, but she can't send it. Good morning, everyone. We're just gonna take a few more minutes. We're trying to get some files over to the computer. Thank you for your patience. You're ready to take out and start your there. So we'll do this. I know. I've never seen them. No, I'm being liar. I'm like, oh, nice. You're ready. And people online. It's specifically for. Several of them happened yesterday. Well, I heard one. I'm for something happening, and I went a bunch of videos. Yeah, yes, funny. I know it's sometimes, like we would want. Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know it's an Amber. Right, which is also not. It's not. Okay, good morning, everyone. I think we can start. Good Friday morning. I just want to thank you all for joining us here. I know it's the last day. I think half of the conference has already left, so really appreciate you participating. We're really excited to share some of the developments in the World Bank and water practice. So I think it's going to be a really interesting session, and I'm looking forward to all of your feedback. We're also very honored to have the government of Ethiopia representatives here who will be sharing the great work that they have been doing over the years on WASH. So just to introduce myself, I'm Claire Chase. I'm a senior water economist with the Water Global Practice at the World Bank. And I sit in our Global Director's Office, Siraj Kumar Jha, who will be speaking after this session with Aaron as the closing plenary today. So before we get started with the presentations, we have 3 presentations, and then we will have a panel discussion. I just wanted to give a bit of background and framing for some of the work that we're going to be sharing today. And some of the developments that are happening sort of at a larger scale in the World Bank and the development finance community. So I think we all recognize we're living through extraordinary times. After decades of progress in reducing poverty, the COVID pandemic really set us back. Many more people living in poverty, much more inequality. We're off track to achieve the SDGs. And then in the background, of course, we have the rapid pace of climate change and increased crises, conflict globally. And we have billions of people that are lacking food security, lacking access to water, sanitation, and energy. So these intertwined crises have motivated the World Bank to initiate a process of evolution. And I will describe sort of the four elements of that evolution. One is we have adopted a new mission statement that makes it, gives the World Bank a formal mandate to both fight poverty, which has always been our core mission, but also to address global challenges. So challenges that span across borders have externalities and are more difficult to address at the country level, climate change being really the main one that we can think about. We're also innovating on the financial model. So we know the investments required to achieve the SDGs are massive. In the water sector alone, it's estimated to be 6.7 trillion by 2030 and another 22.6 trillion by 2050 is needed in water-related infrastructure investments. So we need to innovate on the financial model, both freeing up financing within the institution, but also looking at ways to increase domestic financing, and also to mobilize private capital to contribute to the development finance. The third element of the evolution is really around partnerships. So just a few weeks ago at the annual meetings in Marrakesh, the World Bank signed a historical agreement between 9 multilateral development banks with the idea that we will now be sharing much more information on our lending pipelines, identifying co-financing opportunities, and some of these innovations on the financial model that are happening within the World Bank are also going to be happening within those multilateral development banks. And the partnership also extends to strengthening our collaboration with the UN agencies and bilaterals and all of the development partners. So that's really a key part of this evolution, really trying to work more closely together and uniformly on achieving the SDGs and the global challenges. The last element of the evolution is around global challenges. So identifying what are the core global challenges that we need to address. Through a process, the World Bank came up with 8 global challenges that were endorsed by our executive board. Most importantly, for those of you in this room, is that one of the global challenges that will be part of a pilot of 6 going forward is water security and climate adaptation. So what that means is that now in the World Bank, the water agenda, and as much as it relates to climate adaptation and mitigation, is at the highest level of priority. So I want to really emphasize that we see this as a real game changer in how we can address the challenges that we've all been talking about in these rooms this week. So that, I hope, is a at least accessible way for me to describe what's been happening sort of at a larger scale in the World Bank and the development community, and gives you a bit of context for today's discussion, which is really going to focus on more of a regional effort to catalyze investment and how country platforms are central to this agenda. So I think what you will see today is really embodies some of the ideas that we're looking at in this evolution process about country-led programs, national platforms, which can be a mechanism for bringing in all of this financing that I talked about, the other multilateral financing, but also really an emphasis on the private capital mobilization. And we'll hear a very good example of how this has been working in Ethiopia over many years. So without further discussion, I want to get into the presentation. So just briefly, we're going to hear on 3 presentations that will provide different perspectives on these country platforms, how they can be used to scale up financing and WASH services, and how they can be models for other countries. And then after the presentations, we have we'll hear from panelists who have experience and in working in country platforms, and also working on some of these systems strengthening and systems change that is a big focus now to support that private capital mobilization. Okay, so let me get started. My first speaker is Nishta Mehta. She's a water supply and sanitation specialist with the World Bank, and she's going to be talking about the World Bank's support to Eastern and Southern Africa region for systems change and scaling up WASH access. So she's online. So I'm going to see Nishta, if you can.
Hello, everyone.
Okay, so I'm going to do your slides if that's okay.
Yes, that's totally fine, Claire. I'll just tell you when we're ready for the next one. And you can hear me clearly? Everything's good?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, wonderful. Then I'll just jump right into it.
Sorry,
whenever you tell me that you're ready with the presentation.
Yeah, there we go. Go ahead.
All right. Okay, so I think Claire already discussed what I'm going to talk about. We're trying to accelerate access to WASH in Eastern and Southern Africa, and I'm just going to tell you about where we are in the process right now and what's coming up next. So next slide, Claire. I'm going to try not spending too much time on the next few slides because I think Claire's opening remarks really covered where we are. We're not on track on achieving SDG 6, and what we're seeing out there, it's kind of staggering. And Claire talked a little bit about the financial commitments that we need to meet these, objectives, and again, we're nowhere close to finding having that resources available. Next slide, please. So if you look at this slide, you'll see that the highest water and demographic stress is right now in Africa. And the lowest human capital index coincides with wherever you see low WASH access and other water services, of course. 90% of the natural disasters are water related, and water scarcity is impacting GDP. We can see reductions up to 6% by 2050, which is again staggering for countries that are, some countries that are already struggling for resources. Next slide. So I think the one statistic for Africa, for sub-Saharan Africa, that really sort of impacted us that are working in the sector, impacted anyone that we speak to, is that while the world is progressing, sub-Saharan Africa is sliding backwards in absolute numbers. 274 million more people in the last 2 decades don't have access to basic water. 37 million, and 247 million or more are without basic sanitation. 162 million more are defecating in the open. There's basic hygiene lacking for almost 500 million more. The gaps in school WASH are staggering too. 45 to 50% of the schools don't have access. 85% of those without water, and about 70% of those without sanitation are in rural areas. So while this is a rural problem, it's also fast becoming an urban problem, and we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. The consequences of this gap and this widening gap are staggering. We're seeing half of global maternal deaths are in sub-Saharan Africa. poor sanitation, we already know the consequences of poor, like with mortality and morbidity, diarrheal diseases are still the leading cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa. But we also know what happens when access improves. In a recent study, we found that if there's treated water available in the home, it's causally linked to higher completed schools in almost 39 sub-Saharan African countries. So the evidence on both sides is very clear, right? If we don't do anything, this situation will worsen, and the impacts of that on human capital, on health, on employment, on everything is staggering. And if we do something, if we manage to increase access, the impacts of that are also positively staggering. Next slide. So I mentioned that you know, that the impacts on people are staggering, but the service providers are also not doing that well, right? Services are failing very soon after construction. Utilities are losing too much water, which also means money for them. We're not doing enough on efficiency and sustainability. Better targeting of public funds is required to reduce the access gap. Every dollar that is spent on subsidizing O&M in a water utility, we believe is a wasted opportunity to expand services, particularly in rural areas and peri-urban areas. So we have to tackle operational efficiency, whether it is by increasing revenue collection, lowering operating costs, reducing non-revenue water. In 50% of the countries in the region, household tariffs are insufficient to recover operation and maintenance costs, which leads to disrepair, and we get into this, you know, tough cycle of build and neglect, and then finally, you know, we abandon whatever it is and we build more infrastructure. So I think overall there's a lot of rethinking that is required. Next slide. Next slide, Claire. Okay, so I mentioned to you that, you know, even though we're identifying that currently the problem is more rural, it's not going to stay rural, where African cities are already running dry. It's one of the highest urbanization rates that we're seeing. And there's large gaps already in many of the countries, including DRC, in Tanzania, in Mozambique, and in Uganda. So some of the fastest growing cities in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa, and the water investments in these areas has not kept up. Livability and productivity in major cities, Mombasa, Dodoma, it's already compromised, and people are getting only 1/4 of the water that they need every day. By 2030, which is, you know, in very near future, there's going to be 350 more Africans living in cities. And if we're already providing 1/4 of the water that they need, the situation is going to become much worse going forward. So cost-effective, diversified water storage, efficiency in terms of water delivery as a services is needed urgently. So next slide. And within this sort of scenario, and you know, this came from the very top at the World Bank, we said, okay, we cannot continue doing what has been happening in these countries, and business as usual is not an option. We have huge access gaps, we have huge investment gaps, we need to change systems. Many solutions already exist in the region. We just have to figure out how to scale them up and how to sustain progress. And how do we sort of bring all of these solutions together so that we can learn from good examples and then scale up success. So I'm going to next take you through what we call our systems change approach. Thanks, Claire. I'm going to take you through our systems change approach. I'm going to quickly mention each of our actions, and then we can go into a little bit more detail on each action. So address sector level governance bottlenecks, mobilize private and partner financing, realign sector-wide incentives, design climate and disaster resilient WASH systems, and finally, 5, create country-level platforms for WASH. So next slide. For the first, addressing sector-level governance bottlenecks, how do we do this? We have to promote national prioritized investment programs that include results-based incentives and robust institutional accountabilities to promote these reforms. These incentives can be targeted at addressing financial and institutional capacity, really building clarity in roles and responsibilities of various institutions, improving intergovernment collaboration and coordination, strengthening oversight, regulation, reporting, taking a very holistic approach to giving equal or higher attention in some cases to peri-urban and rural areas that are really suffering right now, developing medium to long-term engagements through utility turnaround programs to boost creditworthiness and improve services. We're seeing examples of success. As I said, there are a lot of examples of success within Africa. We need to really sort of think about how do we scale these examples up. So in Kenya, for example, there was an internal government-led reform process which really focused on separating policy and regulatory functions and devolving services to county governments. In Mozambique as well, we saw the developing of a financing mechanism and a revenue stream. Regulatory framework was established for tariff collection. In Mozambique, we've seen success. Sanitation access increased from 9% to 37% in the last 20 years. In Kenya too, the basic access to water went from 39% to 70%. So these, just removing these bottlenecks and addressing policy and institutional functions can have huge impact on access to wash. Next slide. So the second action is mobilizing private and partner financing. And again, Claire mentioned some of the financing gaps that we have. We have to increase our investment almost by 4 to 5 times right now. 75% of the countries in the region report insufficient financing to meet their national WASH targets. And this graph kind of shows you how sector financing should be evolving. Development partners need to join forces in co-financing as much through country platforms that support national programs. Public financing needs to increase as the sector becomes more efficient, and private sector has to kick in with a more robust, efficient, transparent, as we become more robust, efficient, and transparent, the sector. So we need to maximize financing by public financing. Governments need sustainable national WSS investment programs, which mobilize domestic resources through billing, collection, create predictable and transparent intergovernmental resource flow, and then are backed by strong and credible institutions. Concessional funding, given limited funding from development partners, we have to explore co-financing. Private financing, again, this is a long-term approach. We need to bring in the private sector, but we also need to simultaneously work on our own sector efficiency. So I just want to mention one example. In Angola, for example, public financing to leverage capital investment had 1.1 billion through the sector through guarantees and PPP. So we're seeing some of this come around in Africa, where there's major shift in even the way the sector is being financed. And I think that, you know, we need more such examples if we want to meet this gap. Next slide. So this is sort of realigning sector-wide incentives. And I've already spoken about this a little bit when I spoke about bottlenecks, so I won't spend too much time on this slide, but I just want to mention that most of our utilities are still on step 1 of this ladder. And you can see from this graph that there has not been much progress on cost recovery in sub-Saharan Africa's major utilities in the past 15 years. So every dollar invested in subsidizing O&M, as I mentioned, is a wasted opportunity. It can be used to expand services. One example of this is Uganda, where NWSC in Uganda, there's a long-term trajectory on efficiency improvement to achieve creditworthiness. As a result of this, Uganda has been able to obtain loans from 3 commercial banks to the tune of $38 million, which is really impressive. And again, an example that we can really learn from. Next slide. So design climate and disaster resilient WASH systems. I mentioned earlier that most of the disasters in this region, climate related disasters, are also water related disasters. So we have to think about how do we protect and enhance natural storage options in watersheds and underground. Programmatic approaches at country or regional level. We have some projects within the World Bank. There's the Kenya Watershed Project, the Horn of Africa Groundwater for Resilience Project with SIVA and I think UNDP. So we have to repurpose and optimize existing storage as well to meet multiple uses. And I know that they're trying to do this in Dodoma with AFDB. We also have to diversify resources and increase large storage infrastructure for rapidly growing cities. Again, this is happening in Mombasa with AFD. So there are, again, good examples that we can learn from and take to other places, but this is really important. We need to think, we need to innovate, and we need to think about how best to design infrastructure that responds to the world which is changing with climate. Next slide. And this is sort of the crux of what we're talking about. One way that we believe is going to be essential in terms of addressing these access gaps, these financing gaps, is to create country-level national platforms for WASH. I'm not going to go into the One WASH because I think we have people much more learned than me on that topic that are coming up in this session, and I'm really excited to hear them talk about the One WASH multi-donor platform from Ethiopia as well. But I just want to talk about the benefits. The benefits of a country platform are that it's structured around a national investment program. There's more government ownership. There's better coordination between various agencies. You can aggregate results. You can look at what. So I have a colleague who left the bank who used to say the beauty of our sector is that it touches upon everything, and the challenge of our sector is that it touches upon everything, right? So the beauty of the national program is that it allows the sector ministries from education, from health, from other related other related areas to come in together, and we can really coordinate and address the WASH access challenges in one sort of unified voice with clarity on the reform path and a clear pathway of what's coming up next. Next slide. So what are we doing? We are at the World Bank, we're accelerating implementation of our existing WASH portfolio. We're really pushing on this. We're scaling up World Bank financing for the WASH agenda in this region. World Bank is committing to increase our financing, and we're partnering with other organizations because we can definitely not do this alone if we want to achieve impacts at scale. And all of this is really being driven by the countries themselves. We play a supporting role, as we always do. This is being driven by the countries themselves. Last slide, Claire. And I just want to mention, when I say we cannot do this alone, there are a couple of things that sort of came into this strategy that sort of have helped us define the strategy. We had a meeting with the sector ministers in New York on the sidelines of the UN WASH conference, where we really discussed what is systems change, and we got endorsement from the ministers of Eastern and Southern African countries on this strategy. Then we refined the strategy based on their inputs. We went back during the World Bank IMF spring meetings and presented this to the finance ministers, and we got inputs from them and refined this further and sort of defined what the country platforms could look like. Now we're having a big event in Addis Ababa in November, in the mid of November, 14th and 15th, where we're going to present this back to the sector and finance ministers together with development partners who will be in the room with us, and really work out what the roadmap looks like to deliver on this strategy and to really sort of improve access to WASH in Eastern and Southern Africa. I will stop here. Thank you so much, Claire. Back to you.
Thank you so much, Nishta. And I think also just to reflect from that presentation and going forward, this concept of the systems change, which I think our panel will also get into some of the concepts that have been discussed from other partners and experience with this systems thinking. And then we will hear more about the platform. So let me turn it over to Ato Abi Girma, who is the national coordinator of the One WASH national program in Ethiopia, and he's going to be sharing about the program.
Okay, good morning and thank you. I'm a National Watch Program Coordinator. Prepare this presentation with Dr. Mikhail, his coordinator for water and energy. What you do? Yeah, let me say a few words about the sector content. That's the country have more than 120 million population. That is almost 80% are from rural areas, and annual rainfall it is more than 980 million meter cube in spatial decisional variation. We are saying that in some part of the country have too much water, in another part of the country little of water, and more population are living in low water areas. More people are living in the western part with excess of water. We have 12 river basins. Groundwater source accounts are 80% is drinking water for the country. There is some main significant progress in the last 2 decades. That's 35 million people have gained access to improved water. Also, when we see in sanitation, also in the last 20 years, 40 million people have got access to basic sanitation. Another important thing is the institutional institutionalizations and programmatic approach. So the sector have its policies, strategies, and develop a program. And this is a national sector-wide program with the platform donors prepared the document, and the One Wash national program in Consolidation account is established. So the status so far is that 45 million people have basic supply, because we are about 20 million practicing open dedication by the past as well. As example for other countries, how this One Wash national program is evolved. We started from random supply-driven project-based approach, then go to plan demand-driven program-based approach, and where we are now is planned and harmonized sector-wide approach. So, as a background, before it was less service delivery for urban and rural water and sanitation. It was decentralized. The capacity contains isolated projectized approach and inadequate sector financing, and the system there is lack of M&B systems. So the principle, especially what we are implementing in the country, the One Wash national program, have 3 pillars, that is integration, alignment, harmonization, and partnership. These principles are implementing the One Wash national program, that is integrated water supply, sanitation, integration, water, health, education sectors, and including finance, aligned partner planning and manage the system, and harmonized partner approach. This is principle of lead the One Wash plan, one budget, and one reporting, applying the One Wash national program. Also, there is partnership. It is a good partnership between CSOs and civil society organization and private sector. The program have 5 components. That is rural and pastoralist wash, the urban wash, the institutional wash, that is including health and schools are included here, and the main component is here the climate resilient wash, because the country is frequently affected by climate shocks. So this component is one important component we included in this program, in the program management and capacity building. Basic principles, the program is centralized, responsive to the communities, and demand responsive. Also consistency. One Wash national program is consistent with national policies and national strategies. also equity. It is addressing the equity to different regions and socially disparate of wash coverage among and within the regions with districts and urban areas. Also, the principles are, include the inclusiveness in transparency, participatory monitoring and evaluation, and sustainability, and finally, gender is included. Key steps for aligning here, I want to mention two points, that is loads given and we take. From the government side, as you see here, undertakes the national ocean boundary already we had, and this is the baseline for the program, and prepare a universal access plan, prepare a government lead national program. This is the One Wash national program strategy. One strategy is now in process. Also, critical wash sectors like education, health, water, and finance are going to plan, execute, and monitor together. This is very important things that is done by the government, and establish a national coordination mechanism, which is the program is led by the National Steering Committee. Then the technical support for the National Steering Committee is technical team, and the coordination office in place. From the partner side, as you see, that support government in this process, that is technical assistance. The partners are doing technical assistance and studies preparation for manual and guides. They are supporting, agree to support one government program, one financing port, and one monitoring and evaluation system. Now, before we are preparing for different donors, separate report plan and other things. Now this is reduced for as earlier presenter said, 8 donors are supporting this port. We are preparing one plan and submitting one report for the effort to channel resources to one government report. It is listed in the established task force. Also agree to use World Bank fiduciary and safeguard arrangement. This is very important because others are getting satisfaction that if the World Bank is taking the responsibility for this one, the other one is going to implement support and mission protocol. This is the major things, is the mandatory things, organization structure. As you see, the oversights from National Steering Committee to lower part, and the reporting is coming apart. This is the financial flow. That is, all donors are putting their money in one basket. As soon as that they put their finance in one basket, they use their identities, and it's go to health, education, and finance sectors, and go down to regional bureaus, down to the communities. The other thing, sector opportunities, that's own government leadership, and regional and federal governments, population management, and structure and sector policies are revised. There is 10 years program plan in this country. One wash platform, there is community-based operation maintenance structure and rural and clean guidance and manuals are in place. There is a revised water and supply design. And also there is a new integrated water resource management strategy is prepared. This is the success factors, that preparation of our national program in advanced centralization and clear in the intergovernment physical transfer and agreement of transfer resources to the government account instead of establishing task force and partners flexibility to give up some of their territories like safeguard and fiduciary responsibilities. And jointly, we are doing jointly sector monitoring and evaluation mechanism. Finally, key needs to address key sector challenges are divided in 3 elements. The first one is the policy strategy and legal framework. Here we are lacking of absence of regulatory framework. We have to work on this one. Limitation private sector engagement. The other one, the second one, when we see the institutional part inadequate sector delivery in the absorption capacity. We need to increase our capacity, lack of clear systematic organized sector capacity building program with coordination between wash and water resource management. This is very important things we have to strengthen. The final one is technically sustained service delivery, continuity sector priorities. Also, the water security, climate change adaptation, and frequency drought floods. This is the major challenge that the sector is facing. I think that I have short of time. Thank you very much for listening. This is the part that's supporting the One National Program in the country. Thank you very much.
Well, perfect timing. So I really appreciate that. But I think you brushed over something that was very important on your success factors. It was at the very bottom, and it said the most critical one being government of Ethiopia ownership and leadership of the program. I think that is key. So I hope we can discuss that more. And we have some other partners here in the room, UNICEF, CDO, I believe also. So we can get into, and it's a long running program. So this is nothing new. We've learned a lot and can be a good example for other countries. So our last presentation, before we get to the panel discussion, is going to be Rochi Kemka, who's a Senior Water Resources Management Specialist with the 2030 Water Resources Group in the World Bank. And she's going to be sharing about scaling up financing for water and country platforms. Let me open your slides, Rochi.
Thanks, Claire. Great. So if you can help move to the next slide. So recently the World Bank developed a new strategic framework on scaling up finance for water, essentially to see what were the binding constraints to private sector participation and private capital mobilization, and what the World Bank could do differently to address these constraints. So as a part of this exercise, we looked at the portfolio of engagements in the past in the water sector and what the issues were in being able to leverage private sector participation. And as you can imagine, a number of factors came up, including the undervaluation of water, weak enabling conditions, the lack of financial viability in the sector, and multiple risks to structuring public-private partnerships in particular. Based on this, we identified a number of strategic directions of areas where the bank could do engagements differently. And you see the details on the screen. Firstly, establishing the enabling conditions or the foundational elements to promote creditworthiness in the sector, ensuring that private sector expertise, not just capital, is brought on board to improve operational efficiency, and ensuring that the entire spectrum of finance solutions is looked at, including PPPs, debt instruments, microfinance, vendor finance, etc. So not limiting it to one solution alone. And then lastly, ensuring a cross-cutting focus on climate outcomes. So based on these strategic directions, we came up with a roadmap of 10 steps, which I'll show on the next slide, which includes a combination of demand and supply side factors. So on this slide, you see these various 10 steps outlined, and these steps are not sequential. So they can be adapted based on the country context. So firstly, it looks at the foundational elements of creditworthiness in the sector. So how do we ensure that there is capacity building to support the enabling conditions? Then it looks at a number of analyses and diagnostics. For example, assessing the macro fiscal situation, the investment climate, ensuring that water is aligned with climate goals, including the nationally determined contributions. The fact that there should be supportive governance mechanisms and policies, institutions, and regulations at the national level as well as at the subnational level. Then integrating a focus on financial sustainability in sector planning and as a part of the World Bank's own project lifecycle, so that there is a focus on the treaties of taxes, transfers, and tariffs. There's financial viability analysis and modeling that is really leading to the genesis of new programs. The turnaround strategies is another key element of this. How do we ensure performance improvement plans across different subsectors? So WASH, but also other sectors like irrigation, water resources management, etc., and use performance-based contracts and other tools for such improvements. Then coming to the financing or the supply side solutions, creating a pipeline of bankable projects. So how do we ensure that there is matchmaking of demand and supply? And how can we potentially also pool projects to reach economies of scale and look at more aggregated results? Then a key factor is ensuring that there is local currency financing that can be mobilized to ensure that foreign capital does not lead to a mismatch between the currency in which revenues are generated and the currency in which capital is mobilized. And then it's mobilizing the entire suite of funding and financing solutions, which I already spoke about, looking at a suite of different options. And you'll see at the bottom here that one of the key elements of this approach, which is a cross-cutting theme, is to have a coordinated approach with different stakeholders so that all the different stakeholders are essentially promoting the same principles to be able to crowd in private sector participation in capital and to move the sector up the ladder as Nishtha was indicating previously. Next slide, please. So our approach to private capital mobilization is based on market maturity. So it looks at a combination of upstream to downstream interventions. So in higher risk markets, a lot of the support is around technical assistance to improve technical and financial efficiency, and to use that as the basis to draw in more capital over time. But if you're downstream in a market where the risks are lower, then you could more easily tap local capital markets and also raise commercial finance. And then there's this middle bucket where there is medium risk. And this is really the space where there is opportunity for more de-risking, both through the World Bank's own engagements, but also by partnering with other institutions, IFIs, other MDBs, local financial institutions and such. And in this bucket, you would see that there's opportunity for looking at policy reforms through different financing instruments, looking at results and output-based financing. There could be some guarantees that could kick in, various credit enhancement tools. But you could also look at, for example, blended financing solutions where commercial and concessional finance is blended to support different projects and also reduce the cost of capital. Next slide, please. Just a word about the current global context. There are a few challenges in the macro space. For example, monetary conditions are tightening. There is more persistent inflation, as a result of which there are higher interest rates, and that results in a higher cost of capital. And the previous speakers already spoke about the slow progress on water SDGs and how that's compounded by climate change. So this combination of the tightening environment at a macro scale, as well as the sector issues in water, really requires much more systems level leadership. And that's the basis for engaging in collaborative models and supporting country platforms. Next, please. So these country platforms, and where I sit in the World Bank in a unit called the 2030 Water Resources Group, we've been looking at these country platforms systemically across different countries to promote the agenda of water writ large, and essentially to see how public and private sector could come together. So these platforms bring together different stakeholders. These are usually chaired by the government at quite senior levels. So in some countries, they report into the president or the prime minister's office. In other countries, the platform is chaired by the cabinet secretary, who's the senior most bureaucrat, and then would have participation from all the different and relevant ministries. So not just water, but also the agri-ministry, urban development, finance, environment, rural development, industries and commerce, what have you. But they also then bring in private sector through CEOs of different private sector companies who represent a larger sector or industry interest, civil society and academia, as well as multilateral and bilateral agencies and international organizations. And one key principle of this platform is that no single stakeholder group has majority of the seats. So, for example, government, private sector, civil society, they would each have less than 50% of the seats. So it really provides much more of a rounded perspective across the stakeholders on how they could advance solutions. Next, please. So these country platforms, they optimize the roles of the public and the private sector. So the public sector would still have overall responsibility for improving sector governance, creditworthiness, ensuring adequate pricing, and resource allocation, as well as capital planning. But there could be a more strategic use of public funds, essentially to crowd in the private sector. And the role of the private sector itself goes beyond only providing debt and equity and combinations thereof. Private sector can also contribute expertise to lower costs in the sector, improve collection, increase revenues, and all of that can help with financial sustainability as a step towards more capital mobilization down the road. So where there are aligned incentives between the public and the private sector, such collaboration can actually help the sector advance along the lines of financial viability. Next, please. So there are different elements that these country platforms can support: matching demand and supply for finance, engaging in blended financing approaches, ensuring a comprehensive engagement process from upstream to downstream, and ensuring that private sector essentially can come on board, and then ultimately resulting in concrete projects and programs which can translate the platform's priorities into tangible impact. Next, please. So I'll share with you 3 different examples from 3 different countries, and in fact 3 different regions, to show how these platforms have been effective. This is an example from the Ganga Basin in India, where we had one such platform established to look at how wastewater treatment could be advanced using a new PPP model called the hybrid annuity model. So in the past, the issue in the country was that there was a lot of construction of assets, but not adequate maintenance. And it was because there were either EPC plus O&M contracts that were in place to bring in the private sector or contractors on board, or DBOs where there wasn't really skin in the game from the private sector. And so the World Bank, through various different units and teams coming together, developed a new approach called the hybrid annuity model, where essentially the concessionaire has to mobilize 100% of the investment up front, but they're only paid 40% of that capital investment at the end of construction. So they still have skin in the game, and 60% of that CapEx is paid over a long-term period, so a 15-year O&M period, along with the O&M expenditure. And this is paid out as annuities. And this is essentially to ensure that there's performance-linked payments to the private sector, to ensure that there's not just the construction of assets, but also the operations and maintenance of those assets over a prolonged period. And the platform really helped to engage different stakeholders, engage with the private sector, understand what kind of risks private sector was facing. So for example, one of the solutions that was brought forward is to ensure that a separate escrow account was set up for payment security to the private sector. There were also tripartite arrangements that were enabled between the municipality, the private sector concessionaire, as well as the center, because the private sector felt that the risks were too high to deal directly with subnational entities. And there were multiple other such interventions. So it was really through a collaborative approach that the structuring and the solution was developed. Next, please. Switching regions to East Asia, to the country of Mongolia. So the platform there helped devise a new water pollution fee law, which was ultimately approved by the country's parliament and cabinet. So this law promotes wastewater treatment and reuse. So it encourages large businesses and industrial units to pre-treat their effluent before discharging it into central sewers. And the structure of the law is such, and the payment mechanism is such, that if you meet the wastewater standards, you have to pay a certain fee. And if you're not meeting the standards, you have to pay a much higher fee based on toxicity and volume of effluent. So it encourages industry to pre-treat before they discharge to avoid the fees that would kick in. And it also promotes reuse, because industry, compared to before, was treating its effluent to much higher standards that could be used for productive purposes. So this was developed in concert with commercial utilities, power plants, tanneries, mining companies, and others, again, through a platform approach. And it has provided upstream investments and financing for wastewater treatment. And through the fees that have been collected, it's also providing revenues for the operating expenses of the central wastewater treatment plant. And 22 of the largest users in the city of, in and around the city of Mongolia are already implementing pre-treatment as a result of this. And currently we're looking at projects for wastewater reuse by the central heat and power plants, including potential World Bank financing coming in. Next, please. This is my last slide, again, switching regions to Africa, and particularly South Africa. where our platform helped to develop a national program on municipal loss reduction, which is called the No Drop Program. It's the first such national water regulation program, and it provides a rating scorecard to rate each municipality on the baseline and the improvement in non-revenue water over time. And it provides a rewards and penalties system where essentially there are carrots and sticks if you're meeting targets or falling short. And this led to the development of a number of performance-based contracts with private sector participation in the country, and also resulting from that investments to improve both municipal as well as industrial water use efficiency. So 3 different examples, but it shows the power of these platforms to tackle sort of the key issues within the country and really promote more private sector participation, capital mobilization, and ultimately scaling up finance for the water sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruchi. So now we're going to turn to our panelists, and I will invite the panelists to join me up here on the stage, and then I will introduce them. We have one panelist joining us online, and I'm also inviting the speakers to also, Honorable, I think, would you? Ian, are you there?
Good morning.
How are you?
Yes, I am. Yes.
Okay, I'm gonna just try to find out how to get you on the screen. So let me first introduce our panelists. So we have the Honorable Ambassador Asfa Dingamo Kame from Ethiopia. Thank you for joining us. We have Ellen Walter, who's an international advocacy expert with IRC WASH. And Lisa Rudge, who's WASH advisor with the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And online we have Ian Menzies, Senior Water Supply and Sanitation Specialist with the World Bank. So I promise we're going to get to Q&A. We started a little bit late, so I had 2 rounds of questions, but I think I'll start with one so that we can then open it for any questions from the audience. So let me start with you, Honorable. If you could just talk about, I think one thing that has been part of our discussions this week is really around engaging with the civil society, ensuring that we're listening to our beneficiaries and incorporating their solutions into our programs. So one of the key elements of the One WASH program is this partnership with the CSOs and also the private sector. So I would like to invite you to talk about this and maybe also to address any challenges or opportunities that you see with this engagement with our civil society and how that can inform and support the implementation of the program.
Thank you very much, Marita. Good morning, everybody. I'm very glad to be here this week, and I have learned a lot. Also, I could see where we are. So it is a very good opportunity for us to bring the practitioners, researchers, the implementers, financiers. So this is a very wide experiences we have already done here, and also we have also our own experiences. I think Abiy has made a very clear indication of what we are doing on One WASH national program. This One national program is a flagship national program. I think now we are implementing it for the second phase. The first phase has given us a lot of information, and we tried to put some weaknesses we had in the first program. And I think this is a more refined one. So it could be a very good platform also for other African countries, our friends and brothers who are in the continent. One of the major issues we have brought together is the alignment of the policies. As you know, 4 ministries came together. And this has helped us really to harmonize our efforts, and the implementation became more effective every time, despite the capacity of implementation limitations are there and here. When it comes to the questions you have raised, really in our program, we have brought as core the partnership between different actors who are working in the sector. And among the civil societies are one of our partners who are engaged themselves to enhance the efficiency of our program. Especially, we are working closely with this. Some of them are supporting in capacity building. Some are already directly implementing the program already devised. As you know, from the first presentations we had, I was talking with my friend Dr. Daniel, who is from UNICEF. The figures which were brought forward is a bit, very low when it comes to access to water supply. Even the Ethiopian country is a big country, second most populous country, we alone have around 14 million people which are not accessed to potable water. So your presentation, especially the first presenter, should look at the figures. And that is my comment on that one. But civil societies are very good partners in WASH initiative in our country. And we are working very closely because they are implementing some of very good water supply schemes in the country. Others are supporting us on capacity building, training. Some are working on research. And I think our relation is very high. Even we are trying to see some of innovative approach those civil societies are implementing in the water sector. And the challenge in the country we are facing this time around is, as you know, 60 to 70% of most of technologies are coming up from outside. And, the price escalation, inflation issue, which are almost, during the COVID time, most of our projects delayed, and the cost overrun has been a very big problem. That is not only on government-run programs, but in programs where the civil societies are implementing is also not out of this exception. So, despite all this, I think our partnership is increasing. We are working closely with them. Our relationship is very good. Some of them are already here, and they can witness how we are trying to see them, despite all difficulties we have in the country in implementing the program. So this is what I would like to bring.
Thank you, Honorable. So let me now turn to Lisa. And FCDO has been doing very innovative work on the WASH systems that we learned about this week. And so I would like to hear from your perspective, some of the findings. I know you had some early insights from the WASH systems assessments, but some of the thinking also perhaps and how you will be addressing these systemic constraints to scaling up.
Okay. Thanks, Claire. You're being very generous because the program has only just started. So I'm not sure that we're there yet, but hoping that we can share some good insights in the future as well. So maybe just to thank fellow panelists, firstly, and then I think my first comment is just in case you didn't hear it from anyone else or you weren't paying attention in the presentations. I think if we're going to attract additional finance, we need those strong systems. So I'm pretty sure you all caught that from the presentations, but it came up in every single one. There's no surprise. We've been talking about it all week. So there's nothing really new for FCDO here. It's just, coming to the realization that years and years of funding infrastructure and services does not automatically lead to the sustainability, the climate resilience that is needed. And so that brings me to efficiency, right? So I think the main point here is, and what we've heard is that we won't be able to attract more finance if we don't have that efficiency in country, if we don't have accountable and the kind of strong governance arrangements around that. So, for example, we could de-risk some investments, but if we de-risk them and then the longer term, some of these policy regulatory elements are not addressed, then the risk kind of still exists, right? So it's really important to kind of build on that. I think the second point, and it's come out again very strongly, is around kind of leadership. And so, we haven't found anything amazingly new in our assessments, but what we have tried to do is align behind that leadership. So it's, again, I think I said it the other day, it's about our mindset, it's about everybody's mindset and trying to align behind that with a strong plan, a strong vision, and then mobilizing and bringing the resources together to make sure that we are having a dialogue about where there are gaps and also where one type of funding can be more efficiently allocated or can fill a gap. So, for example, I'm sure the Honourable Minister has this challenge as well in Ethiopia, but it's come up in other countries as well, which is there's a huge demand for services. So the pressure on governments at local level, at regional level, at national level are to fulfill that demand. But sometimes the systems aren't moving or changing or strengthening fast enough in order to make sure that initial CapEx investment or the infrastructure investment is then sustained and the operation and maintenance follows. So what we found through the assessments is there's been a lot of demand in kind of working on the regulatory environment, building the capacity at the subnational level to make sure that those happen, but also thinking through HR capacity, procurement capacity at that subnational level, or the capacity to manage those delegated contracts so that you create more capacity in the system from the bottom, rather than from the top. So I think that's been some interesting points there. I think one of the last points I'm going to make is just around this collaboration. So again, we won't be able to allocate resources effectively through the current system, I'm going to say, which again, I think the Africa Investment Partnership and your work captures quite well with where the funding comes from, the grant funding, the public funding, the private and the multilateral funding. And we need a dialogue around how do we allocate that best, right? And so I think those platforms are absolutely essential at the country level, and that's been something that's really come through from our assessments. including this multi-sectoral approach. So again, we talked about it, but hygiene, sanitation, these are really multi-sectoral, and they need that dialogue across governments. And it needs to be clear where public finance funds flows. So it flows obviously from the Ministry of Finance, but is it best spent through the Ministry of Health when they've got strong capacity at the local level to deliver some of that sanitation or hygiene? And that may differ from country to country. So really understanding that and having those kind of programs that align with the national policies and the structures in place. So I think I'll stop there. There is that was mainly what we found in our assessments, and there's lots of detail there. But
Excellent. A lot of rich material. So thank you, Lisa. So Ellen, over to you. And in fact, IRC WASH and you yourself have done research on the multi-stakeholder platforms in WASH. So I'd really love to hear some of your findings and thoughts about what are the challenges, right? I mean, we've been talking about how wonderful these are, but we know they're not straightforward, and there are a lot of issues that need to be ironed out and challenges along the way. So
great. Thank you so much. And thanks to panelists and to the presenters, and Claire, to you for coordinating. IRC, just to be very clear, IRC has done with Sanitation and Water for All in the research and learning constituency. So it's a lot of partners that were involved in this most recent research on multi-stakeholder platforms. There were 6 countries that were part of that, but only 3 of those countries were in Africa. And just to also be very clear, Ethiopia wasn't one of those countries. So some of the things that I'm talking about, I think, particularly what we've seen as the engagement of civil society and the platform that exists under the One WASH National Program is a little bit of an exception to, I think, some of what's happening and what we're seeing in other countries. But a lot of the multi-stakeholder platforms, they're present, but things like coordination and really concrete actions related to that are insufficient and often lacking. So there is a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue, really good information exchange. But when it comes to things like the essential functions of collaboration and accountability, that accountability is often one way. The accountability, there's no mirror that people are holding up to themselves. So there's some challenges related to that. There is the access to information being timely and that it's adequate enough to feed back into those platforms for accountability purposes and decision-making purposes is also often lacking. And this is all kind of what came out of that research. And I think the most interesting and significant finding, there's many significant findings. My colleagues would not be pleased if I just chose one, but I think for me, the most significant is that the support that's needed, both the financial and human resources to really run those effectively are often missing. So the resources are thin. They are project-based. They're around particular maybe 1 or 2 actions, but aren't covering that kind of full scale of the systemic change that's needed from a multi-stakeholder platform to really drive that systems change. And you didn't ask me this, but I'm just going to mention quickly, I think some of the things that we can do to address some of these challenges are around the emphasis on building and advancing what is already there as a multi-stakeholder platform. So the national ownership, which is, I think we're seeing really great examples from what was provided already. And then identifying, again, those sufficient resources to support that process. And having, these concrete plans with clear roles and responsibilities of who and how are people participating. There was one really great point, I think, of this no stakeholder group has the majority. I think that that Ruchi mentioned. I think that is amazing, and that should be kind of a key component going forward. And so yeah, there's a lot around that, and the role of advocacy kind of in all of that to really advance the way that the multi-stakeholder platforms and all of the actors can be playing to kind of advance the process. I've always more to say on advocacy, but I'll pause there so that we have more time. Yeah,
Let's see if somebody asks this question in
great.
the Q&A. So Ian, over to you. And I don't know if you'll be able to get on the screen. I've been trying to communicate backstage, but no response. So my colleague Ian Menzies, who is based in Addis and works very closely on the One Wash National Program, is here with us. And Ian, I wanted to also get your reflections on, can we attribute some of the success of the One Wash program on achieving access targets to this country platform? And what have been the challenges with implementation? And how does that reflect in the progress? So over to you.
Thanks, Clay. Sorry, I wasn't. Well, I must admit, I wasn't looking at the backstage communication. I was listening with great interest to the presentations. So if you can't see me, apologies, but you're probably not missing very much. So, I think. Oh, good. Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully that's okay. So, I think. I coordinate the World Bank's program in Ethiopia. I'm based in Addis here. And it's great to see Ato Abiy and State Minister Ambassador Asfaw with you. I mean, they've been working with this program for a long, long time. And, I think a lot of the strengths are in its history, in its evolution. I've only been here for a few years, but, the MOU, was signed back in 2006 between health, education, water ministries to start this joint implementation of WASH activities. And then this is followed up, another 5 years later in 2011 with the establishment of the WASH implementation framework. And one important factor within that was that includes a shift to financing through the government's own block grant transfer system. So using the government's systems, I think, is important. And this uses the government's own fiscal transfer systems as the main mechanism for funding. So that the platform itself, the program was established 2015. So it's already 8 years under implementation. It's in its second phase. So a lot of lessons learned, as Ato Abiy referred to. So it didn't happen overnight, and it's evolving as we go on. So, this consolidated WASH account that you saw, which funds all the donor money and is managed by the Ministry of Finance, is important. So, this started with the World Bank and FCDO. It's great to see FCDO here as a key supporter, but then a year later, African Development Bank, UNICEF joined, then the government of Finland joined, then 2019 for the second phase, we had the Saudi Fund for Development, the governments of Netherlands and the governments of South Korea. So, we have 8 development partners channeling funds through into the consolidated WASH account. It's a swap, sector-wise approach. So, but it's important, I think, for all the development partners, that the money loses its identity in the consolidated WASH account. But the results are attributable, on a proportional basis. So, I mean, if you look at the funding, which I think is interesting for this project, so $300 million from IDA, 100 million from FCDO, the Saudi Development Fund, 65 million, the Dutch government, 15 million, the South Korean government, 7 million, government of Finland, 4.5 million, UNICEF, 5 million. So that pulls together nearly effectively $500 million worth of development partner money into this consolidated WASH account. We all share in the attributable results. And in addition, we have a contribution of almost $100 million from the government of Ethiopia. So this is a $600 million program, 8 development partners. And as we're discussing before, you know, the platform and the implementation arrangements include the Ministry of Water and Energy, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Education, and Ministry of Finance. And they are the governing and implementing agencies of the project. And this is, so we have a National WASH Steering Committee and platform. State Minister Asfaw is on that. So that comprises ministers and state ministers. They meet periodically and are responsible for the high level governance of the project. So this, for me, is the strong point of this platform, and working with the government. This is quite unique. You know, many projects I've worked in before, you'll work with the water ministry, education and health. It's very difficult to get engaged in this discussion on WASH, but one thing we know, and Claire knows very well in particular, you know, is universal access is not just about households. You know, it's WASH for schools, it's WASH for healthcare facilities, it's communal WASH facilities, and it's public facilities. And unless you're pulling all that together, you're not going to achieve universal access and all the expected outcomes and benefits. So this is the platform to do it. And when you look at resource allocation across those ministries, again, in the past, I've seen in other countries, you know, you'll get a big competition, say, between Ministry of Health and Ministry of Water over sanitation and so on. That just doesn't happen here. The allocations to those respective ministries and sub-activities are set out in the operations manual, and everybody accepts that, you know, and that's how they participate. So for me, you know, as the team leader for this, from a governance perspective, you know, we have one procurement plan, which is big, to cover all these activities. Over 1,000 procurement activities. I'm responsible for managing that, as well as the financial management of the whole fund with the ministry, and ensuring safeguards compliance to bank standards, which basically I think is why the development partners are very happy to be using this mechanism. I think you know, so we have, as Abby's saying, for this whole $600 million program every year, you know, we have one report. So there's the annual report. Everything is in there. This is the government's report, annual work plan and program. There, it's one document. We're not we don't have, as we might have had otherwise, each development partner doing its own project, 8 different projects, 8 different PIUs, 8 different supervision costs, and so on. So the transaction costs are significantly reduced, and it makes coordination much easier. We have regular meetings with the development partners. So FCD co-chairs the development partner group with me, which is great. You know, so regular dialogue between the development partners, and also, as the ambassador knows and Abby knows, you know, very regular meetings on implementation progress and implementation issues at this scale.
Thank you, Ian. I want to make sure we have.
Running out of time. Okay, there's lots to say.
We have questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Back to you. Thanks.
Great to have your perspective, because you're right in the thick of it. So please, let's open for questions. I think we have time for one round. So I'll take 3 questions. First, hands up. And you've got the straight line back here. So let me start here in the front. Oh, sorry.
Happy to speak loudly.
You just
Well,
speak
I think
loudly,
it'll be picked
For
up
the
by that.
speakers.
It's picked up on
You can use this.
Thank you very much to all the presenters and the panel for some really interesting discussion. Learning a lot about Ethiopia and the national platform that you've described. My question, reflecting on some experience I've had with the World Bank working on the Sahel Groundwater Initiative, which is a regional program across 6 countries. How is this systems approach going to scale at a regional level? And secondly, a number of those countries in that Sahel program have undergone a lot of political turmoil and a lot of conflict. So how do systems-based approaches fair when there is a lot of fragility in the region or even at the country level? Thank you.
We'll take all the questions.
Thanks, this is Andy Narrow with UNICEF HQ. My question is, what is the percentage of that One Wash fund that goes towards infrastructure investment versus supporting government to strengthen systems, governance, data, and all the rest of it? Because I reflect on World Bank study, there was that pyramid of where does the funding come from to fund that many trillions of dollars to reach the Sustainable Development Goals. And ODA assistance is a drop in the ocean compared to the rest of it, which comes from improving efficiencies within the current sector, which means investing in non-revenue water and sustaining the life of existing investments. So I'm wondering, yeah, in that light, why are we focusing on ODA and not on system strengthening? Thank you.
Thanks, John Rosenbaum, and I have two questions that connect to Andy's. One is thanks, Ian, for your plug on swaps, which seem to make a lot of sense. They've been around for about 20 years. They have not taken over the sector. Actually, they're pretty rare. Great to hear that in Ethiopia it seems to be working, but if we acknowledge that, yes, ODA will continue to play a role, what do we need to do to have more of this and promote local ownership more? The flip side is that in an earlier presentation, we heard more about how do we create local currency markets and more scale up of private investment and a whole host of other things that would be really great, all of which stand or fall with the credit worthiness of your service provider, which as Andy indicated, needs a lot of work that the bank knows a lot about. You run trainings in the stuff, we can say. But it was all very abstract. Do you have targets at country level? Do you have numbers of what you're striving for as an institution to actually help that happen, build that capacity, and that will lead to better investment? Thank you.
My name is Nick Holzler from the Metadata Smart Center Group. I have a question on self-supply that was mentioned by the State Minister. We think that self-supply, and especially if it is used for production for income, has a huge potential to be a funding source, and especially to reach the SDG 6.1 in the rural area. And we have examples of self-supply where pump functionality is over 90%, and then people pay part of the investment themselves. So my question to the panel is, should self-supply, and especially productive self-supply, not be included in the policy? Thank you.
Thank you so much for the questions. I'm going to hand the mic here. We don't know yet who's. Let me.
Who wants to go?
Yeah, and then you can go, would you,
What?
maybe you go first on the last question or what?
Yeah, last question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Han, for this question. Actually, I thank all of you who have participated in forwarding the number of comments and questions. Basically, the self-supply approach for funding water schemes is quite a new approach, which is already we are looking at. As you know, our policy, especially now we are almost changing it and upgrading it again to align all the policies to come together at the country level. You know, the 2000 policy doesn't give a room for private, you know, engagement, especially on supplying water supply or for the community and the private partner. But you know, the operation and the maintenance, of course, it is possible to have a private financing in that policy. That policy is now under review. And we are looking for the financial, really, the private finance to come in and have that kind of, not only for water supply, but also for sanitation issue. We are integrating the sanitation and the water in this new policy alignment. I have had a discussion with you, and I'm looking forward really how to try to implement. As you know, the 2006 you know, UN has declared water supply as a human right issue. Human right issue. So for those communities where the capacity is not there, the financial capacity is not there, it's government who has a responsibility to supply its citizens with water, potable water. So that is the approach we have been following. But through years, it is not possible only with public financing could solve all the problems within the society. And I think bringing PPP approach is very important. And in the new policy alignment program, we have already took into account this public-private partnership, you know, approach. So when we put in implementation of that one, we will see in those areas where you know, with the economic situation in the country is becoming more better, and the more people are coming to this income level, so that would help really to screen up and have a self-sufficiency approach on supplying the water in particular communities, so we can scale up in the places where it is possible. So that is what I would like to do.
Thank you so much. And I know it's after time, so if you need to leave, please don't, I'm not keeping you here, but I do want to be sure that we can properly respond to some of the questions. Nishka, do you want to take the one on the promotion of more local ownership? And the reason I'm asking you is because I think that's really an emphasis of this regional approach and exposure, different countries, you know, the Ethiopia example. How do we sort of create that spark for other countries to really take this on board?
Yeah, so yeah, thanks, Claire, and thanks for the question. A part of what we are doing in the UN WASH, then in the spring meetings, and now with the WASH summit is really sort of bring this platform approach to other countries so that they can see how successful it is and what are the advantages of it. On the regional level, so the priority is really helping countries build these national platforms around their own investment plans and really coordinate within the government agencies that exist for countries. On a regional level, what we're trying to do is sort of develop a monitoring platform so we can look at the progress we are making regionally and also really share with countries what the progress is, where countries are doing well, what are the successful examples, and sort of create this opportunity for cross-learning. But the focus right now with the platforms is to do national country level platforms for WASH. I also really, I want to really touch upon the FCV point that was made as well. So, you know, this is the reality of the region we work in and also other regions, right? There are fragile countries that we're working in. So one of the principles of the systems change approach is to strengthen the service providers, really focus on the utilities or even the rural service providers to focus on their efficiency, their operational sustainability, their financial sustainability, so that while we can't conflict proof service delivery in some cases, but at least we can make it a little bit more resilient to regular government changes, to elections happening in the countries more frequently than probably they should. So I think that, you know, the idea is to work at multiple levels within the country, at the service providers level, but then also at the national government and various government agencies level, to sort of, as much as we can, shock-proof the systems change approach. But really, I mean, that's a reality that we grapple with and we try to work within. I'm happy to share with the colleagues that are in the room outcomes from our WASH Leadership Summit in Addis in November, because that will really highlight some of the roadmaps that the countries are coming up with on how they want to achieve universal access to WASH within their countries, and then how we're approaching this regionally. So I'm happy to share those outcomes with colleagues in the room if that is interesting to them. Thanks.
Thank you, Nishta. And then maybe, because I think it's a really key point to address. So, Rochi, do you want to take the question on, I mean, the ODA, as you call it, development finance is such a small portion of what will be available, right? We know that. So how, and I think that's really where this private capital mobilization, but also domestic resource mobilization comes in. So maybe just to touch on that point, Rochi, and then Lisa, you can also, I think, address the system strengthening part and some of the mention of the efficiencies that need to happen in the system.
Thanks for the question, Claire. Indeed, I mean, we know that the available resources are a drop in the ocean compared to the requirements. And I think all the presenters and all the speakers have touched upon this. Unless we address the foundational issues, unless we look at technical financial efficiency in the sector, we strengthen creditworthiness of the underlying utilities and move the sector towards more financial viability to draw in, private capital and other resources. We're not really going to meet the SDG targets, and we're nowhere on track as it is. So I think it requires this trajectory of reform. The demand side management, these foundational issues is definitely a core of it. We're also seeing some encouraging results, across the World Bank through supply side innovations as well. We know that demand side management is a more medium-term effort across various geographies, whereas the requirement for capital is more immediate and shorter term. And there are a number of opportunities that exist there. So for example, optimizing the water energy nexus. So, retrofitting, let's say, wastewater treatment plants and utilities to improve their energy efficiency is a no-brainer. It's a low-hanging fruit. You reduce energy costs, energy consumption, you make the utility more sustainable, both from an environmental standpoint, but also from a financial standpoint. And also then move the sector towards being able to draw in private capital. There's also innovations such as looking at impact bonds or sustainability linked bonds. So for example, the World Bank recently launched such a bond in Vietnam. So it's principal protected and it draws in capital from institutional investors who forego coupons against carbon credits that the project would generate. So there are different ways of sort of moving the sector forward and looking at a combination of demand and supply side interventions. And then, as I spoke in my presentation, there's this middle bucket of sort of medium risk where there is a need for de-risking. And that's also a space where different agencies are playing a key role. None of this is to say that it's a substitute to creditworthiness and that we can sort of innovate our way around that. but there are opportunities emerging, particularly as we look at nexus issues to drawing more capital. Thanks.
Thank you, Roshi. Last words from the rest of our panelists, maybe just in a 30-second, 1 minute.
Okay, just 30 seconds. Just on the point on fragility, perhaps. So I think there's some really good examples of what can be done working with systems, acknowledging that the system isn't one system, that there are lots of systems, and in a fragile context, you're working across those systems. And it speaks a little bit to the point on ODA. So the percentage of ODA that flows into a country depends, right, as well. So in a fragile country, that might be more than another country. And so I think it's about thinking strategically again, and that's what we're trying to do through our assessments about where that niche element is that we can really support. So is it extending the regulatory function to a sanitation, or is it supporting another region or another district? So I think so that's slightly different from the fragility, but I think we're definitely looking at that and aware and building on some good examples. And I'm happy to speak about some examples in DRC afterwards. Thanks.
Just a couple of things. One, on the scale at regional level, I think it's important also to keep in mind the engagement and what kind of engagement is most effective with regional political and financial bodies and the role that they can play, particularly around accountability in all of the things that we've been discussing so far, particularly the support that they're already showing for systems and systems change and system strengthening. And then I think just building on what was said before about this opportunity for cross-country learning and collaboration, seeing things firsthand, learning from peers at very high political levels, bringing those voices together, I think there's a real opportunity to do that. And on the fragility side, just finding that right angle, I think, as you said, as Lisa said, to kind of what's that point of entry that's going to be most effective. And there's a lot of really good examples of where, when you find those right entry points, what you can do about them. So just thanks for that.
Thank you, Ellen. And Ian, over to you. Last word.
Okay, I think just 2 or 3 quick observations. I think when we're looking at the financing gap, and the biggest challenge for me is not the amount of finance that we can pump into the sector, which is needed, but it's the implementation and absorption capacity, I think, is the biggest binding constraint I'm seeing at the moment. There's a question on swaps. We had a big swap in Tanzania, which had huge problems, and the biggest problem was governance. And looking at where money went, it was implemented through the sector ministry, which I think was a big mistake. Here, what we're seeing in Ethiopia is all the money is channeled through under Ministry of Finance control. The governance arrangements are much stronger. And the third point, just quickly on this issue that Roshi was talking about on private finance. My experience in Kenya, we were doing a lot of work with blended finance with the Dutch government, who are looking to set up a pooled fund, a pooled bond, for utilities to access. And that largely failed because other development partners wanted to put their money, concessional funding and grant funding, into these more creditworthy utilities. So they had no incentive whatsoever to borrow from these blended financing sources. So in the end, unless you've got proper development partner coordination to facilitate private capital mobilization, it's not going to happen when incentives are misaligned between development partners. There are 3 quick points. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. Very, very realistic final points. I think we need to keep all of those in mind. So I'm not going to take any more of your time. Coffee's on me. So thank you all for staying. Thank you for being here. It was a really fascinating conversation, and I hope that we can continue the dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.